So we have a quorum, that's nice. All right, so we'll get this meeting going. Welcome everyone to the City of Everett Planning Commission, Tuesday, July 16th, 2019 meeting. Can we have roll call, please?
Chair Beck.
Here.
Commissioner Lavra. Here. Commissioner Tisdall.
Here.
Commissioner Zielinski.
Here.
Commissioner Finch.
Here.
All right, so has everybody had an opportunity to look at the minutes from the last meeting? Any changes, proposed changes, or any moves to adopt?
So moved.
Second.
Commissioner Finch.
Yes.
Commissioner Zielinski.
Yes.
Commissioner Tisdall.
Yes.
Commissioner Lavra.
Yes.
Chair Beck.
Yes. All right. Any reports from any commissioners? We'll start with Commissioner Finch.
None.
No report.
I went to the housing forum last week in Bellevue, and it was interesting.
Is this the same housing forum you went to last year?
No, that was put on by the Master Builders. This one was put on by Association of Washington Business and the Association of Cities and Counties, and it was a whole different group of people, but same issues as affordability and where we're going to put them and how we're going to get them there. And
So that was the big theme, is
Yep.
affordability. Yeah.
and no solutions, unfortunately.
No report.
And no report for me, so.
Yes, Alan Giffen, Planning Director. Want to mention a couple of things. One is at the City Council hearing on the moratorium on supportive housing last week, moratorium on supportive housing in single-family zones only. The council had about a 2-hour public hearing and did send back for Planning Commission review the potential for amendments to the code. They identified roughly a dozen issues that they want Planning Commission and staff to review, preparing a report for your meeting of August 6th. That'll be a public workshop, and we will talk about the supportive housing regulations and the issues that have been sent to the commission from the City Council. That would be a workshop. Public testimony will be encouraged, so people are welcome to come and provide comments to the commission. We expect there will probably be at least one more workshop, and then a little bit later in the fall a public hearing for a decision on any amendments that you may choose to recommend to the City Council. So we're looking at your meeting on August 6th being that subject, and on August 20th a meeting to talk about our comprehensive plan docket applications that we've received for this year's docket cycle, and we'll also talk about commercial and industrial zones under ReThink Zoning. So those 2 nights will be, if you could put those on your calendar, or I think Kathy's asked if commissioners will be available for those 2 meetings. Let's see, was there something else? Yeah, I think those are the 2 items, yeah.
Okay. Does anyone have questions regarding these dates or these issues? How many docket applications did we get?
Just 2.
Okay. And what were the applications?
I'll let David talk about those.
We have 2 docket applications. One is for some height amendments in Metro Everett along Everett Avenue near the QFC. And then the second is change from single family to multifamily and subsequent rezone for along Norton behind Sequoia High School.
Does anybody have any other questions? Okay. So I think we have a new staff member, right, in the planning department?
Yeah, sorry. This is Alex Bird. She's one of our newer planners. Been with us for about 3 or 4 months now.
A little over 2.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
She's just having so much fun. It feels like 4 months.
Yeah.
Alex Bird, she comes to us from having worked a couple of years in California, and happy to have her here. She's working down at the Cedar Street permit counter, but also helping out with some of our graphic needs. She's got some software skills that helping us with some of the graphics on ReThink Zoning.
Wonderful. Welcome.
Thank you.
It's nice to meet you. Please.
Nice to meet you all too. Yeah, so just a little bit of background. I'm originally from Ohio, and I graduated from the University of Cincinnati in 2017 with my bachelor's degree in urban planning. And then from there, I moved to the San Francisco Bay Area, where I was working as a planner for 2 years for a small town in the Silicon Valley. And I started with the city at the end of April. So yeah, I'm happy to be here.
We're happy to have you. So
Nice to meet you.
You have 2 planners in front of you. So why planning? I always love finding out why people go into urban planning.
Yeah, I kind of just stumbled upon planning. The University of Cincinnati had part of their design school, they offered an urban planning program. And it was actually a co-op program. So I did 5 internships when I was in school. So that kind of like sold me on the program, and my freshman year, I just thought it was really interesting. So
We're happy to have you.
yeah, thank you.
All right. So moving right along, item number 1 is rethink zoning for residential areas. David, is that you?
That is me, David Selheim, Long Range Planning Manager. And so tonight I'm going to walk you through some of the residential conversation of rethink zoning. And so as we talk about it in the office, we've been about the 50,000 foot level, and we're starting to get down to about 30,000 foot level. And so we're still talking a lot of concepts and things, but it helps narrow down some things as we go forward. And Alex is gonna, as mentioned, she's gonna help on some of the housing stuff as part of this. And she's also Steve Inglesby watchdog to make sure we don't write standards that they can't implement at the permit counter. So Steve's doing that too. So what we're going to do tonight is we're going to look at a photo stream, and I sent you in the memo a link, and hopefully you've had a chance to look at some of those, but we'll take a snapshot of a few of them. Then we're going to look at some conceptual residential zones, 4+ and overlay, and as Commissioner Zielinski said, maybe we might need 5, and we're kind of at 5 a little bit with this concept. And then review conceptual housing types by zone that we're looking at to have a discussion. So the Sightline Institute just put together a nice photo stream of some of what they call the middle housing types. And so for those of you that want to go to the whole thing, it's on flickr.com. Photos /sightline_middle_housing, and it gets you to the whole thing. But I am going to shortcut that, and because I preloaded all these, and take a look at the first set of ones, and I'm going to just kind of go through these. And then again, some of these are ideas of some of the housing types that may or may not fit. I picked a few pictures, images that some of them, look nice and some of them don't. Kind of thing, in my opinion, kind of thing. And I think we all have our own opinions of what we like. And so as we look at some of these, I think some of the things that are important, especially as I'm starting to look at standards, are things about entrances and roofs and how far above the street grade, parking access, things like that, vegetation, landscaping. All those are different standards that we can have as we start writing the development standards. And so this one, this set of images are duplexes. So this one happens to be in Wallingford, I guess. Here's another duplex with a shared porch. Looks like it's in a single family zone. I think this is some new construction that came in to that neighborhood. Oops, I don't want to go through their whole thing. I need to remember using these tabs here. Here's a duplex that was kind of, I think, newer construction in Portland that was added. Again, looking at some things that might be good things and otherwise. Here's a duplex that looks like a historic building, maybe originally built as a duplex. It could have been converted too. Some of that is happening after the fact. In this one kind of looks like, so the patterns on the staircases might indicate maybe that it was original. Another duplex. And another duplex. So a lot of these sightline I've put together are out of the Portland area, and some in Seattle, some in Wisconsin. I don't think I picked any of those, or not many of them, because they have pictures of snow, so that's a little bit unusual. I recognize it because I'm from Wisconsin. Okay, so I think this one we've already seen. This is at another duplex. It's also a townhouse, so I think this one had separate ownership. Here's a townhome in the central area, I think, of Seattle. They've been building quite a few of those in the central area. Another townhouses in the Fremont district. Some townhouses in Ballard. And some central area townhomes. And some interesting things here is not only the garage doors, but how far the entrance is above the grade. And townhouses also in the central area. So moving up to a little bit larger units. This is a triplex, historic building, probably built that way. Another triplex on top of each other in this case. This is a triplex in the Portland area. Fourplex in Portland. Fourplex in Seattle and Ballard. And this is, I think, a fourplex as well. So the last set of images that I have, a little bit larger projects. This is Walnut Hills Courtyard Apartment, row houses. Kind of a courtyard, a bungalow court. Some low-rise apartments. And 14-unit building in Dexter Avenue in Seattle. So a little sampling of different housing types. Some of those are the housing types kind of being looked at in some areas, and again, as we think about development standards of which ones kind of might work in some of these areas. So I'm going to walk through now is the things that we had in the paper, the concept things. And so for single family zones, first off, the current single family and conceptual designations. So everything so far in the map that we've provided to you is all the same. No changes in terms of land use designation. So none of the areas that are designated as single family were multifamily or vice versa. Reminder, we went through this before, but our existing single family zones in the entire planning area, not just the city limits, 46% of our entire planning area is designated for single family, and there's 5 existing single family zones. And the conceptual designations we're looking at is urban residential 1, 2, and then urban residential 2 with a transit overlay. So kind of 3 zones concept.
And David, just to be clear, that's 46% of the entire planning area for the city, including industrial. But what percentage of housing, the housing area, does that the existing, or would the UR1, UR2 take up?
I don't have that amount.
Okay.
It's a great majority.
Roger that. Thank you.
Yeah, so 46% is the entire planning area, so the same percentage consists, but we're not, right now as part of the zoning, we're not zoning outside the city limits. So, I mean, it still will be 46% when we get done with it. Potentially, there's some potential for some underlying land use changes, but. Okay, so the urban residential 1 designation, looking at criteria for designation, it would have 1 or more, and so larger lot sizes prevail, often with steeper terrain. It could be without alleys, could be without with incomplete sidewalk networks, and generally not within walking distance, which is a quarter mile frequent transit or rail. Some of the general development standards looking at is 7,000 square foot lots, lot width 60 feet, and lot coverage 35%. 2.5 stories, which is the same height that we basically currently have, and a front setback of 20 feet. So as we look at the draft map that we have put together, just kind of looking at it, so most of this area is going to be in the south end around Forest Park, towards Mukilteo, also in some of the areas along the riverfront, and then down in the south end around Silver Lake, in some areas a little bit closer to the airport. In some of those areas, none of those are within a quarter mile of transit. In any of those areas, the frequent transit, excuse me, 3 trips per hour or more, so the Swift routes or Route 7 for Everett Transit. So that's kind of our draft map that we've put together so far. So in the housing types in the UR1, so in addition to the single family detached, some of the concepts that we're looking at are single family attached, and so with a couple conditions there. So one of the things that we thought that might be important in this zone is to have individual ownership opportunity created. And so doing that through either things like unit lot subdivisions, condominiums, cluster subdivisions, things like that, so that as you do a single family attached, is that you're creating an ownership opportunity there. So it's one of the things that we're seeing a reduction in ownership opportunities, and again, it's part of that housing affordability goals that we have. Have some density standards of 1 unit per 5,000 square feet. In there, design standards would be required, and so trying to find those things, and then to have a review process too, which would be noticed to neighbors would be required as part of that process. Looking at corner lot duplexes, only where individual ownership opportunity created again as well. Design standards would be there. In this case, there would be the draft that we have is review process 1, no notice required as part of this, and there would not be any density requirements, so they would just have to meet the minimum lot size of the underlying zone as part of that. Cottage housing, which is typically, which is this image down here, is smaller houses kind of clustered together. Again, same density standards. They're usually lower profile, 2 stories. Design standards would be required, and the review process 2, notice required to adjacent property owners. Accessory dwelling units, we went through that about 2 years ago for a lot of these standards. Largely keeping the same owner occupancy required of 1 unit, 800 square foot maximum, but to simplify the code, we're proposing in this concept to remove the 75% limit. Right now there's a requirement that it's 800 square feet or 75% of the principal dwelling unit, whichever is less. And so we're moving that 75% so you can go to 800 square feet and make code stuff a lot simpler and kind of allow for kind of a minimum accessory dwelling unit. Height standards are the same in the code, 24 feet on alley lots and 18 feet otherwise, and review process 1 as part of that. So that's the UR1 zone. UR2 is looking at criteria for designation there, smaller platted lots on flatter terrain, so essentially the exact opposite single family zones than the UR1 zone. However, this also would not be within walking distance of quarter-mile frequent transit or light rail. Smaller lots here, 4,500 square feet, narrower lot widths, 50 feet, a little bit higher lot coverage, 40 to 50%. Same heights as the UR1 zone and same setbacks as the UR1 zone. So in this map, so this is the other areas designated single family. So UR2 would be in the north end, a lot of platted lots, flatter terrain in there. And then also the other areas as you go south in Everett, but not necessarily along some of these corridor areas within that area. For housing types here, so the same housing types in the UR2 zone as the UR1, making a few adjustments in this concept. Is first off, for single-family attached, ownership would not be required, and the density would be less, so 1 unit per 1,500 square feet. And so those are the basic differences between the UR1 and UR2 zone for single-family attached. Same thing in corner lot duplexes, owner occupancy not required. In all of these, we would have design standards to make these, try to make sure that they fit within the neighborhood. Cottage housing, same thing, just a different density standard. And accessory dwelling units, owner occupancy not required. Did you pass on the comments of Chris?
Just a question for the commissioners. Do you have comments from Chris Holland? Okay, you got his email. Okay. Yeah, he wanted to make sure that we pass those along. He had some comments about some of the design standards and housing types, and so we're not going to read those into the record, but just for your information, and we'll have a look at those and probably follow up with some comments as we continue in this process.
He also had a comment about the owner occupancy issue for ADUs as part of that. So.
David, I was going to ask about that as well. What's the rationale behind, in this zone, no requirement for one of the units to be owner occupied?
Well, it's one of the things that we're seeing more and more in a lot of the reviews that are happening on this topic throughout this state and throughout the nation, is not to have that as a requirement. And so putting that out there for discussion.
You want to have the discussion now, or should we table that?
Well, maybe we go through this and maybe have
Great.
a discussion towards the end.
Great. Thank you.
That's all right? Yeah. In the urban residential 2 zone with a transit overlay, so same zone, the urban residential 2, but this is within walking distance, quarter-mile frequent transit or half-mile of light rail. And the only other standard that looking at potentially different in here is looking at maybe a floor to area ratio and not necessarily lot coverage. So we don't get, so we get kind of what we want there, and then also another half story of height potentially here. So going up to 3 stories rather than 2.5 stories. One of the other things is potentially reducing the front setback to 10 feet. And I think that as we look at that, I think it really depends on the block, because you don't want to have hit and miss things, and so you kind of want to have that whole pattern of the block to have that happen. But in some areas, it's a transition from commercial to this area, and so that might fit the transition just fine. And so with this area, same thing. So within the transit overlay here, and this is just a simple quarter-mile buffer from the street. We haven't tried to attempt to get it onto alleys or anything like that, and so it's not what would be final if we decide to go forward with this. This was just conceptual at this point in time, but basically following Broadway and Evergreen, and then we have half-mile distance around light rail stations. Of course, we're picking the center radius where we like the light rail station to be located according to our Metro Everett plan, and then light rail down the south end at 526 and Evergreen Way, Boeing Station, and also provisional station at Airport and 99 there. And so there are some areas that are little gaps in here. They actually don't make the distance, but we decided that kind of keep this whole kind of triangle thing happening there. And there's also some gaps where along Casino Road that doesn't meet it, but we would anticipate that in 20 years when we have light rail here and we have light rail here, that the frequency of transit service between those two nodes will be picked up, and so we'd anticipate that some that area would change as well. So the housing types in the UR2 with the transit overlay, so again, same as UR2 with the exceptions of introducing some new housing types. So looking at duplex, not just on corner lots, but anywhere within that overlay area in the UR2. Also allowing the 3 to 4-plex and courtyard apartments. Looking at half-story additional height up to 3 stories. Duplex, again, not limited to corner lots. Triplex, 4-plex density standards at 1 per 1,500 square feet. Review process 2 for those, so the notice to neighbors would be required for 3-story development, and then courtyard apartments, we would have some minimum open space standards, and we would have review process 2 notice to neighbors as well within that area. So in these areas, some of the images down here, for example, this is attached townhomes, duplex, 4-plex here, some 3 to 4-plex here, courtyard or cluster housing, cottage housing, and then accessory dwelling units in there. So moving to multifamily land use zones. The land use map designation in all these areas would be multifamily. Existing zones is 9% of the Everett planning area. Again, we have 5 zones, and conceptually looking at 2 zones, urban residential 3 and urban residential 4. Criteria for designation, already zoned multifamily, but not within walking distance. Frequent transit for the UR3 zone. 4,500 square foot lots, 50-foot lot width, no maximum lot coverage. Height depends on location. We'll have those discussions separately about heights in areas. Looking at potentially some height bonus opportunity like we did in Metro Everett, where you get additional floors for providing some public benefit. Same thing with density, additional density for providing public benefit. So between 30 to 80 units per acre. Having some open space requirements, 100 square feet per unit, and front setbacks at 10 feet. So this zone, again, is going to be those areas that are currently zoned multifamily, but not within the walking distance. And so you see little specks of multifamily in the Delta neighborhood. You see them outlying out in the southwest area, Forest Park area. You see them a little bit down towards Lowell. You see them down around Silver Lake and around the airport area. All these areas in large measure are outside the quarter-mile distance of transit in those areas in the currently zoned for multifamily. So housing types there, this would be a new thing, is looking at not allowing single family and duplex. Again, trying to reserve our multifamily for multifamily purposes in these areas. And so we started doing that in Metro Everett, and so this would be expanding to other areas. Housing types, triplex up through townhouse, design standards required, again 30 to 80 units per acre. Review process 1, no notice required. Same apartments, 5+ units. And then as we look at rooming houses and temporary shelters and supportive housing, the one thing that really to point out is review process 2, which is notice to neighbors for temporary shelter. But for the other things, supportive housing and rooming houses, no notice would be required just to meet the standards. So the last zone is the urban residential 4. So this is zoned already for high density multifamily, including Metro Everett, within walking distance of transit or light rail. Same basic standards for lot size, lot width, lot coverage, height Heights, in our plan, we have heights in multifamily going up to 10 floors, but it all depend on location. Density in this zone would be unlimited, and open space at 100 square feet per unit, and front setbacks of 10 feet. So as we zoom in to this area, you can see these areas that are designated for the urban residential 4, large measure. And again, we used existing zoning to kind of craft a lot of this stuff. Some of it actually is a little bit outside the frequent transit areas, and those are some areas that we'll start taking a look at a little bit more carefully to make sure that they might fit this high density in that area. And then you see along the corridor here and along Casino Road, these areas are kind of salmon colored as being the areas for the urban residential 4. Same standards with the exception that density is unlimited in these areas as the urban residential 3 zone. Single family duplex units would not be allowed within that. So with that, that's a review of the concepts, and again, we're probably at the 30 or 40,000 foot level, and based on this discussion, certain council discussion we'll be having in a couple of weeks too, we'll start working on drafting some standards.
Thank you. Does anybody have questions? Commissioner Finch?
I think starting at a high level, what's the difference in the total dwelling units possible under the current zoning versus the ReThink zoning plan? And do we know how that breaks out between single family and multifamily?
We haven't done that calculation yet, so we'll start doing that this fall, looking at that. I think that when you look at the available land supply, I think that the in terms of redevelopable property, I don't think that you're going to see much difference in that. We also just saw an article the other day that was kind of interesting. Some of the analysis that they did, and actually I think it was a Sightline article that was there, looked at zoning that was done in Portland where they had a lot of infill and had the potential for thousands of units, but over 10 to 20 years, 200 units maybe happened. And so what the potential is and what actually happens is night and day type of thing.
Yeah, well, I think that illustrates the ability to really thoughtfully plan where the density might go,
Right.
given that no one's building out to the max envelope. And so if the practical development is significantly less than the capacity, then we should probably be thoughtful about where we're pushing the development rather than letting it go anywhere. So that was one thought. Commissioner Holland's comment on his concern regarding not requiring owner occupancy for either of the ADUs. I'm just curious to understand what the rationale behind that was and if that rationale might change depending upon which zone we're talking about.
Well, it did in this draft concept in that we had it different in the UR1, a little bit higher ownership rates, I would anticipate. We haven't done the analysis in those areas, but we would anticipate that the overall ownership rates are higher in those areas, and so have it within that versus the UR2 zones where the ownership rates are probably less. And I'm just knowing based on some of the stuff I've looked at, but without any empirical evidence to kind of back that up a little bit. But again, it's trying to find some more opportunities, and the more that we require the owner occupancy, I think there's two things. I think one is what additional work that has to happen from both the developer and from the staff to do that, and then enforcement issues as well. So when we have a requirement for owner occupancy and the ability to enforce that, and so it's very challenging to deal with all that. Mm-hmm. And so I think if there's a compelling public reason, then we should be putting those things in and enforce when we can.
Yeah, I mean, I guess my concern there is that while I appreciate your comments and they resonate with me, I also wonder if we're not creating an environment where we're promoting absentee landlords. And so I wouldn't push it so far as in the urban 3 component, but I think looking at some level of owner occupancy in urban 2 would be helpful. I think you provided those controls off, right, in urban 2?
Correct.
So just a comment to explore, but I think that the character of certain neighborhoods should be retained. And one way to have a hope at doing that is probably require some veil of owner occupancy. I guess my other final question for now is, I notice on the map, which is very helpful, there are some adjacencies between urban residential 2 and urban residential 4. And the idea of going from a certain height and density to, unlimited, it does strike me that we should contemplate some level of transition. And maybe that's not a wide band of transition, but it appears there are a couple areas where, there could be an opportunity for greater density, where we've got urban residential 2 surrounding the SR 526 Evergreen Way node. And then maybe an opportunity for an intermittent zone between 2 and 4 further north of Everett Station to the west.
Yeah, so what we did with this map is we actually use the existing zoning designations to draw it, and so those unique things already exist, but they're not as clear because we have so many more zones. And so now that we narrow down the number of zones, they become a little bit more obvious, kind of thing. So we actually have a work session with staff later this week I've flagged a few of those myself as well. There's a couple challenges in that. So if we go, let's say urban residential 3 or 4, because that's a multifamily comprehensive plan designation, down to a 2, for example, or vice versa, urban residential 2 up to a 3, that would require a comprehensive plan change. And so we're trying to avoid as many fundamental land use changes as possible in the comprehensive plan. And to potentially study those through an environmental impact statement this fall, particularly around the light rail station, so that we can kind of get in and hone in on those areas. So those areas, for example, I mean, if you look at I think you maybe have mentioned that, I mean, around the Evergreen 526 node, I mean, you got a lot of area that is within half mile that is designated single family, for example, there. Those are areas that we want to study in more in depth, and we wouldn't anticipate changing it to upzone those areas at this time. Really looking at that as a 2023 thing, is that we want to study those, look at sidewalks and other issues within the neighborhood, and study those, and that may be a second phase of implementation to change that down the road.
Great. And then one comment on the design standards. I noticed that the images that I thought were attractive personally had a greater presence of a pedestrian entrance rather than a garage entrance, and that really stood out in the images that you showed. And so just a kind of a note to future file when we're lower than 30,000 feet, that garages as the dominant feature on the street front, I don't think is aesthetically appealing.
I would like to second that. Prioritizing pedestrian accessibility for the houses was just wonderfully aesthetically pleasing, so I appreciate that comment.
Just a response to that, and that is consistently shown in any type of visual preference survey that the public responds to pictures without driveways and garages much more positively than those that do have garages or driveways and a lot of cars parked out in the front. Unfortunately, with a lot of our land use pattern without alleys, the only way to get to your required off-street parking is from the street, and so you do see the driveways and the cars parked in them and the garages, and it's in a developed community like ours, it's going to be something that would not easily change, but There may be some ways, some design standards or treatments that minimize the dominant feature of a garage and kind of emphasize the pedestrian access or entrance to a house more prominently.
I just think that, just piggybacking off of that, I mean, I think that assumes that we're going to be retaining car ownership and not going to a shared car model in the next 20 to 30 years. I personally am looking forward to the day where I don't have to deal with a garage or a parking spot. And I think that day is fast approaching, and I look forward to it. But that kind of segues in, and also, addressing, making sure that we have frequent and reliable transit would also mitigate that mobility issue, which brings me to just a quick point of clarification. I saw the difference between, UR2 and UR2 with the transit overlay, and what triggers that shift? Is it just does it have to go through a rezone, or does it just the implementation of a high-frequency route automatically trigger that? Is that too technical right now for the 30,000? But that was one question that was stuck in that I had upon reading it.
I guess my guess is that I think that we would map this as an overlay. And so I think that if there was additional routes that were added, that we would add those areas through an amendment down the road. Wanting to make sure that that route is, there and stable and land use patterns. But the other thing is that we're trying to get to a system where people can also look up their property or property that they're purchasing and identify the zoning and all the overlays. And so when it's map-based, rather than just text language, then we can use a GIS to define that, and you can spit out the answer and say you're in transit overlay, historic overlay, and the UR2 zone, type of thing. So.
Thank you. I also want to tell you how much I like the duplex corner lot component throughout UR1, UR2, and I thought that was an excellent addition.
Commissioner Zelinski.
Just a couple observations. I understand Commissioner Holland's concern expressed in his little email. I don't share it, however. I know that within the single-family areas, there's no requirement anywhere that a single-family home be owner-occupied. So when you buy a home, you have there's a chance that your neighbor could be a renter and not an owner-occupant. So from that standpoint, I don't see a big problem with the way that you've proposed things with your ADU ownership issue. One other observation that has to do with Commissioner Finch's mention of those critical edges, you might say, where two zones that are not contiguous in the concept are contiguous on the ground. I think you can probably manage those when you get to your height maps. That would be one tool that you could use to manage those edges, but I think we have to be careful of those edges. I agree with Commissioner Finch on that. My last one is on the maximum densities. You have a maximum density in the UR without the transit overlay of 1 in 1,500, I think. And that's pretty high density, and you probably wouldn't get to that anyway, but I was just thinking that maybe 1 to 2,500 would make some sense in that kind of a context where you don't have transit nearby. You're going to have parking. There's going to be, even if we don't require it, you'll probably end up with 2 spots per unit as kind of the average that I would expect to see in that kind of a configuration. But it just kind of sends a signal to the market about the kind of the transition down from the 1 to 5,000 for the UR1, that down to, instead of going directly to 1 to 1,500, go to 2,500, and then to the 1 to 1,500 within the transit overlay. So it was just a suggestion.
So one of the things, we'll take a look at that. One of the things is putting that together was the thought, like in the UR2 of single-family attached, of placing a limit of how many units could be attached. so that you don't end up with a whole row of townhouses at 1 per 1,500 kind of thing, because then that starts getting out of the character of the single-family neighborhood and becomes basically multifamily development. And I think that we can look at some of the standards and how this might apply, but it was thinking about some small lots and small infill, so thinking about 3 units and things like that on a smaller lot. And I think some of the initial math that I was doing is that getting to that 1 per 1,500 is perhaps what you need in order to do 3 units kind of thing. So when you set that standard too high, you may not get to the 3 units, and so you create some inefficiency. So one approach I was kind of looking at is limiting how many units could be attached, but allowing that higher density type of thing, and then have separation between them. So
Okay.
but
Well, that might be a good way to deal with that transitional issue.
But those are the types of things, and one reason that Alex is here is to kind of also hear some of these concerns, and so that we can try to sketch these out and see how they fit on a site plan and some sketches and stuff like that too.
That'd be useful to
yeah.
see some, for examples.
Yep.
Commissioner Tisdale.
On this UR3, what's the thinking behind no notification to neighbors? We've had 2 of those situations happen so far, the Berkshire and now this one on Norton. And I just, I wonder why, if we're learning that those things, you know, if transparency is transparency, why aren't we being transparent?
Alan Giffen, Director. Those 2 examples that you cited were for supportive housing in single-family zones. This would be no public notice required for multifamily development within a multifamily zone. So it's a bit different than the situation where you were putting perhaps a larger building within a single-family detached zone. And that currently we do not require public notice for a multifamily development in a multifamily zone unless it's through the SEPA process, if they trigger the threshold for that. But that would be going to a greater level of notice than we currently require. And one of the ideas behind making housing more affordable and the permit process more predictable is when you have a multifamily zone, as long as a project meets the standards that are required in that zone, then there is no need for public notification. We do have some instances, again, when you're not exempt from SEPA, where we would have some public notice. So a larger project would definitely provide notice.
Thank you.
And Alan, for our benefit, would you please just define the temporary shelter and supportive housing types, so I've got a clear
Sure.
contrasting image of those 2?
Yeah, supportive housing is basically a multifamily type of building that has within it services provided for the people, the tenants within the building. And that may be any number of types of services from low barrier housing, which is the case in the Berkshire apartment building, to it could be just people that are homeless or in danger of becoming homeless that may not need a whole lot of intense services, but job counseling or some types of social services of different sorts that would be provided conceivably within the building. A temporary shelter is more like a men's gospel mission men's shelter type thing, where it's intended for homeless people on a more temporary basis. The supportive housing is intended to be more long-term.
How does our code compare to other surrounding municipalities relative to these uses being allowed or possible in certain zones? Do we provide more opportunity, less opportunity, the same opportunity?
Well, without knowing all of the other code's nuances, I did have a request from, or feedback from Municipal Research, and they said ours is one of very few codes that actually has a separate land use classification for supportive housing. There are more codes that do allow for temporary shelter facilities in their codes. Prior to 2016, when we added supportive housing as a separate land use category, supportive housing was basically just multifamily housing, and if there were services provided, we could just consider that to be an accessory to the permitted residential use. The main difference between the pre-2016 and since 2016 regulations is that we have a much lower parking standard now for supportive housing than we did prior to that time. Mm-hmm.
Commissioner Lavra, do you have any comments or thoughts?
Lots of thoughts, but no questions on the 30,000-foot level. Thank you.
Didn't mean to put you
Now
on
you're
the spot.
making me nervous. She's waiting to get down to 5,000, then she's having lots of them.
I just have a few comments. I actually, the trend with the ADU is a lot of municipalities actually did require owner occupied, but they're rolling that back because it was unnecessary, it was administrative. I think Seattle just rolled theirs back, is my understanding. So, but Commissioner Zielinski's observations also resonate with me. So, the other point, actually, I really did appreciate, I am interested in finding out what the percentage of single-family use currently is as a percentage of the residential use in the city. So if we could get that information, and as well as the multifamily use, that would be pretty terrific in terms of what we have currently. So that's useful information.
Could you explain what you mean by that?
So density that's over, I know there's fourplexes and things, but given our current zoning, what we consider to be single-family occupancy, whether it's duplex or in a single-family residential area, I can give you the definitions. I think you have that as UR1 and UR2. So any of the current zones that are under those categories, if we could figure out what the percentage of the current residential land base is, that would be terrific. Mm-hmm. And then the rest of them as multifamily, what those current percentages. That'd be helpful. Yep. So those were my only comments. Any other comments?
Just one final comment, just because, or question, because I'm trying to get my head around where we're going with this. I'm not saying it's the wrong direction at all. I'm still confused as to, are we at a dwelling unit shortage relative to kind of intermediate term growth projections for the city based on the existing densities? I like how we're simplifying this and cleaning it up. And I also like how we're providing for greater density relative to the availability of services. I think that makes a lot of sense, especially from an affordability standpoint. But I'm just confused. It seems like we're adding the ability to increase the density in our city, which could be a good thing. In certain areas, absolutely a good thing. But do we need that additional density relative to the current density allowable under the code? And I don't have a sense of what those growth projections look like relative to our current development potential envelope.
Okay. I'll talk about our current comprehensive plan, which has a horizon of 2035, and our growth target is for the current city limits in 2035 is 165,000. Today we're at about 112,000, and so if we were going to meet that target, our rate of housing development would have to about triple above what it has been for the past, well, since 2000. We are not producing housing at the rate that we need to accommodate our growth projections. There are a number of reasons for this. It's kind of hard to say that there's any simple solution to create the market shift to produce a lot more housing. But what we're looking at is a number of ways that we can increase both housing affordability, housing production. We're hearing it from all over the state. It's not just an Everett situation. There are very few communities that are exceeding their growth targets. There are some, but more and more cities are having a challenge meeting their growth targets under the regional growth strategy. And the number just gets bigger in the future when we're talking about moving out to 2050, which is something that we'll talk about in the future with you later this year, the PSRC's extension of Vision 2040 out to 2050 and what that means for us.
I think that context is helpful, but my question is, based on the potential dwelling units under the current zoning, including Metro Everett, could we add the 53,000 dwelling units that we anticipate needing to meet the 2035 goal?
Yes, we have the capacity. A lot of that would have to occur probably around transit development, especially light rail, which obviously won't be here till 2036, so it's beyond our 2035 horizon to the current comprehensive plan. But a lot of that would also have to go into fairly dense structures, like taller than what we see the current market supporting in the 5/2 in our densest areas of downtown, Broadway, Evergreen Way, where the standards would allow for taller buildings and unlimited density. There's a market factor right now that has just not been financially viable to build at higher cost types of construction. When will we pass that threshold, and when will that market shift occur? That's impossible for us to predict.
Sure. So without going to a high rise, we wouldn't meet the 53,000 dwelling unit target that we're looking at.
I wouldn't say that it's impossible, but there would have to be some tremendous shifts in the market fundamentals for Everett for those numbers to change, and for that, PSRC uses the term bend the trend. So at our current rate of growth, for the last 20 years has been kind of at that pace. For it to take a significant uptick,
Right.
It's more than just zoning.
Right. There would need to be an exogenous economic shock in a positive way to make this area grow. That makes
Correct.
sense. Yeah.
Yeah. I think at some point when light rail gets closer, I think you're going to see that trend bend quite significantly. It's down the road a little bit here, but I think that'll happen. But our existing zoning and comp plan was shown to actually meet our growth targets. So we had approved that as part of a growth management case. So I mean that's all done. And so really what we're doing right now is not necessarily adding a lot more density. The first phase of this project really isn't about adding more units to accommodate the new growth projections that PSRC is going to give us. It's going to add some more. I mean, adding additional housing types of duplexes on corner lots. I mean, add up all the corner lots, and there might be some potential, but how many of them are really redevelopable? And so really the conversation, I think, in this first phase is a little bit more about that middle housing, a little bit of some other housing types, and introducing some things to the community for affordable housing, for ownership types, some other things more than the capacity building. The next phase, again, as we do the EIS work and look at things, is looking at a little bit more of the numbers game of PSRC, of what the new growth allocations are, and how much that can accommodate under this concept. And if we're deficient of where those areas are, that we could start meeting that changing that. So again, looking at the 526 and Evergreen area, where we have within a half mile a lot of single family. So some of those areas, are they ripe for multifamily and taller buildings to build that capacity there? And so those things we'll study in EIS, but we won't. The initial plan is not to do any fundamental land use change next year as part of that, but to have the information to continue that dialogue in the next couple of years. Also letting Sound Transit catch up to us and plan where those stations actually are, so that we know exactly where it is, and so then we could figure out where the land use that will go to help support that, and the other infrastructure needed to support it.
Just so I can crystallize my understanding, and feel free to refine what I'm saying to make sure it's correct. But, as far as I'm tracking, kind of, we have, the way we're zoned right now, we have sufficient we meet our 35 goals, but the way it's set up is it's generally clustered and the market can't provide, a market incentive for the housing we need, like exceeding the 5/2. But with a kind of approach that we're doing right now, we're kind of shifting around some of that density and allowing for like the missing middle, duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, which are traditionally cheaper per square foot to build than the concrete, steel, larger ones. So, is my understanding kind of correct? It allows for us to add density and units at kind of a lower cost than the current comp plan would provide for. Current zoning would provide for.
And it gets back to one of the initial conversations about some neighborhood issues and, why are people going to other areas, and not everyone wants to live in a multifamily apartment. And so these are some other choices that people that want to live in this community and raise their kids and stuff like that to have some other housing types. And so we're not going to be producing mass quantities of this, but we are going to introduce potentially some other housing types for people to choose in this community, that some infill that if done right can fit the neighborhoods. And I think that's part of that conversation is, do we want to attract that type of, is that housing type going to help attract some folks? And if so, does it fit the neighborhood, and how do we make sure it fits the neighborhood and without destroying the character of that neighborhood?
Thank you.
No conversation about cross-laminated timber. There was a lot about that last week and how that's going to change the paradigm, because it's once readily available, which is not too far away, the cost between steel and concrete and 5/2 all of a sudden starts shrinking. Have you guys seen anything about that?
I haven't seen anything. I've talked to some folks about, it's down the road, and it's going to probably be coming here soon. As soon as it does, we have a lot of areas that are zoned for more than 7 stories, and we're so we have lots of it. So,
and are there any incentives around using that?
I don't have any incentives around using that as a tool. We have incentives that allows for people to go to taller buildings of
right.
and things like that, kind of thing. And I think that if everything else pencils out for these people, I think that'll be that's going to help make it affordable for them to build that type. So
okay.
I know they're doing
that's one of the ways
up
we get to the 53%.
Commissioner Lark?
Oh, yeah, I just wanted to piggyback off that. I know this isn't just to put a pin in it, but I had a great conversation a couple weeks back with an individual who's an advocate for CLT, and one of the things they were talking about was selling the carbon offsets for that CLT provides, because it's carbon capture, which makes it a lot more economical on top of that. So, as we're talking about incentives maybe for CLT, maybe we, just to put a pin in it, put a pin to come back later, talking about how we could facilitate carbon, the sale and trading of carbon offsets for people who decide to develop here in Everett with CLT.
Yeah, so that could be another public benefit thing that we look at on the list.
We're working on a climate action plan.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. There we go.
Any news on the consultant?
We will have some news soon. Nothing we can share yet, but it's in process.
All right, any other questions or comments, thoughts?
Would adjournment be after that, or is there? The only reason I ask is I didn't get a chance to report at the top, and I want to make a statement before.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. This is circling back to a conversation that started last Wednesday. Alan, I believe you and I were at the same meeting, the city council meeting on the 10th, discussing the property just south of here in Norton Grand in support of housing. One of the big things that I took away is, in addition to us as a planning commission, we're going to have a lot of homework to do, but I think it is very important for us to not just go through the standard process, but seek to really rebuild a lot of legitimacy in the eyes of the public as we go through and do this. And one thing I more than would like to see, I think we have to do, is to make sure that we bring in every neighborhood and go to a very deep grassroots level and if that involves starting a separate working group to start this process, that's something I would volunteer myself for. But, the process ahead of us as we tackle that issue, I believe, is more than just a zoning question. It's a legitimacy and public transparency question. And so I would very much want to see that component being very well expressed as we go forward on that process. So I appreciate the time. Let me share that. So thank you.
Any comments?
No response, comment and response, no.
Sorry, and I didn't mean to put you on the. So my only comment is what I'm understanding in terms of all this work you're doing, and it's terrific. More tools in the toolbox for more choices in the future in terms of how we manage our density is kind of how I'm looking at it. And I do think it's important that we have more tools because of affordability as we're finding out. This is a huge issue for everyone. And I think what's driving a lot of this too, and I apologize, I'm getting a little bit of a cold, is we're looking at other municipalities and their growth patterns, and they're starting to move up here. And I understand that we haven't experienced the demand that other areas south of here have experienced, but I think we're starting to feel those. Who knows what's going to happen with the market, but at some point, we're going to be densifying the city more because that's just the overall trend in terms of human development, human growth patterns. So I think this is terrific. I really appreciate all the work that you're doing. And with that, unless there's other comments, we're adjourned.